Hi everyone, welcome to another exciting edition of Words, Images, and Worlds. Delighted on this episode to be talking with comics creator Chuck Austen. May I call you Chuck? Is that okay?
That's how you people usually any other name and I don't usually hear or listen. So it's Chuck.
All right, sounds great. I'll mention a couple of titles and works that you've been involved with, and then we can sort of talk through the journey and any that you would like to highlight. One of those being Action Comics, of course, Action Comics. Badger being one of those. Edgeworld, with Comixology, I believe, and
Yeah,
Uncanny X-Men, where you co-created a character called Azazel that's out there
yeah,
in popular media as well.
yeah.
Um, yeah. And then you've also worked on a number of comics adaptations, so like License to Kill, I believe, is one of those as well.
Oh, I forgot about that one. Wow,
Hmm.
yeah, I
Hmm.
sure did. And a Catwoman one, I think.
Uh-huh, uh-huh. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So curious about, you mentioned before I hit record your connection to the written world and curious about how that sort of translated into comics. How did you arrive at creating in comics?
I've always been a visual storyteller in my head. Uh, Things break down almost like little movies when I'm
Hmm.
coming up with my story ideas. So being visual came very naturally. I wanted to be an artist when I was younger. I became one. In fact, I was trained as a commercial illustrator before anything else and went on to draw for a woman who used to do most of her primary work for the LucasArts marketing division. And so I spent a lot of time doing that, but storytelling has always been my passion, my love. I love writing. I've always written even before I was what I would consider to be a professional artist. I was writing short stories and um, prose pieces. Uh, that was my preferred form of story creation. And it wasn't then when I discovered comics at a later age, probably when I was about 12 or 13, as opposed to when most kids get into them.
Hmm.
And that took over my mind as far as being able to tell visual stories. I couldn't afford a camera. I couldn't afford the movie equipment that was needed at that time because you had to actually shoot with film and get it developed. And it was a lot much more expensive and much more difficult process. So, but I could do comics. So I sat down and started working. And that's how I actually still work when I write scripts for Pat in on Edgeworld.
Hmm.
I still
Hmm.
break it down as if I were visually breaking it down as a storyboard. You know, I say this is an over the shoulder shot, this is a wide shot, this is an establishing shot. And that's how I break it down when I send in the scripts. And he's got the latitude to change it and make adjustments because he's got an incredibly strong visual storytelling sense. But at least I have a way of communicating with him that is based on my years of working in a visual mediums.
Yeah, yeah, no. You shared some things there about sort of the process and framing everything up in that way. I'm curious about how that works or has worked for the comics adaptations that you've been involved with, because as you mentioned, you've worked on a Catwoman one, the License to Kill one. So curious about any differences there.
Uh, the no, actually, I've I used those same sensibilities when I was working on those, even more so because I
Hmm.
didn't have the movies to watch ahead of time. They gave us a synopsis usually because those things were kept under tight wraps. We didn't get to see the movie before the adaptation was done, so I had to break it down visually how I would see it based on the story that they were giving us. And by the time I think at that point in my career, I had already been working as a storyboard artist and a director in animation for maybe 15 years at that
Hmm.
point.
Hmm.
So I just brought that language with me. So the artist that I worked with then, that's also how I wrote those scripts. That goes all the way back to I think War Machine, even U.S. War Machine.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, it's kind of a cool connection that a lot of creators have between working in animation and then also working in comics. That seems to be one of the themes that emerges.
It's so common, in fact, that it's kind of a running joke that San Diego Con comes around and the entire industry shuts down because
Right.
everybody goes out of town. There are so many comics people working in the animation industry.
Yeah, yeah. Uh, Also curious, you mentioned working with Pat on Edgeworld. Curious about the collaborations along the way, the relationships that you forged that have been maybe some of the most positive. And then I mentioned a couple of my favorites, but any particular titles that still bring a smile to your face or always bring a smile to your face when you run across them and think about them.
Anything that I created on my own,
Hmm.
Pat and I created Edgeworld. We've got a new series coming out soon, I hope, and I've loved that. Those have probably been my two favorite projects. But then, um, but then I've had some great relationships with a lot of people. I loved working with they don't always like to like to hear it mentioned, but Tom Durenick and Norm Rapman on World Watch when I was self-publishing that superhero comic of my own,
Hmm.
and but Ron Garney on X-Men, Sean Phillips, still one of my absolute favorite collaborations. And he and I never even talked. I just love his drawing style so much, and he tells a story so amazingly well, expressive and and just so fantastically drawn. So I think I had some pretty good relationships with them.
Hmm.
We haven't spoken as much because we don't work in the same business anymore. Ron is definitely a comics guy. Sean is definitely a comics guy, um, but yeah, quite a few. My editors, I'm still good friends with Mike Martz and Mike Raich, my editors on X-Men.
Hmm. Hmm.
Brian Smith, Smitty, my editor from U.S. War Machine. Um, I'm trying to think of who else. Um, I guess those are the main ones. I'm sure there's somebody else will get in touch with me and go, "Hey, dude, you didn't mention me," but
That's
those are
always
the
the
ones off
danger
the
with
top of
that
my head.
question. Always the
Yeah,
danger.
yeah,
Yeah, I mentioned Azazel being one of the characters you've created, so I'm also
yeah.
curious about what it's like to have kind of made a mark in comics that way, and to have sort of contributed a character that now has been in film and um, carries across stories.
It's so weird because when you're creating something for Marvel, you feel like you're kind of playing in their sandbox. So in a lot of ways, I I don't really feel like, even though yes, I totally created him. I'll take entire credit for him. I know there's a lot of people. He's a very divisive character. A lot of people don't like that he even exists.
Mm,
I think Sean Phillips was the first one to draw him in the Birth of Nightcrawler story. But see, then they go back and they retcon everything and they change everything. So
hmm.
a creation for Marvel is like, I don't know. It's like a creation on She-Ra or a creation on something else. It's just like it's not mine. I never really think of it as mine. I never thought of it as mine.
Yeah,
So it doesn't have much impact. And the version that showed up on the screen had nothing to do with anything that I created. It was
right,
an
right.
entirely new story, and they'd gone back in time, and Azazel was a completely different character. It's always fun to have people outside the business who don't understand that say, "Oh, you created Azazel." It's like, oh, that's kind of a nice little ego boost, but it,
Hmm.
it's it's fairly meaningless. I think it'll mean a lot more to me if Edgeworld gets on the screen
Yeah,
or one of the
yeah.
other things that I created gets on the screen. And we'll have another conversation about that. I'm sure it'll be a whole different experience.
I'm sure. Yeah, yeah. And I hope that happens at some point. That would be amazing.
Oh, thank you. We keep getting closer and closer. So, you know,
Yes, yeah,
you
absolutely. Fingers crossed, absolutely.
yeah.
Um, well, I think I only have one more official question, and that is, you mentioned you're currently exploring a new series, so glad to hear that. I always like to give space for folks to talk about current projects that they're circling around and things that they're exploring creatively, and then also spaces where people can sort of find out more about you and follow along and connect.
The only place that I'm visible anywhere, and it's even less and less these days, is on Facebook. Um,
Mhm.
and it's generally a place where I talk about, if I talk at all, which I haven't done much of lately, um, about creativity, how most people want to know about animation and how to work in animation and how to
Hmm.
approach storytelling and whatnot. So I'll post things that I want. I usually wind up teaching the storyboard artists who work for me that want to rise up to become directors or producers. And so I'll put stuff up there about that. Once in a while, I'll have some personal stuff, but very rarely. Other than that, the only stuff that the only way I connect with people at the moment is through those comics that we're creating.
Hmm. Hmm.
And that's that right now that's just me and Pat. It's like we have this sort of private little company where we kind of come up with our own ideas. Like the one Edgeworld was this weird idea that I had that I came to him with and he fell in love with. He had the second one that we're working on, which is more of a horror kind of project. And
Hmm.
he brought it to me and I kept adding to it. So and then we've got other projects that he and I have both contributed and collaborated on, stuff that we'll get to at some point. But those two are sort of the face of what I'm doing anywhere personally right now, other than the novels that I write. Um, so
Yeah, yeah.
and
And I'll ask about the novels as well. So what's it like to work from prose that way and to get to explore in prose because that's a very different way of creating.
it's incredibly different and it's so rewarding. And it's funny because I used to think, well, this is the thing that I do that's not visual storytelling. But my ex-wife used to comment on the fact when she would read any of my novel stuff, she'd say, "No, there's visual storytelling in here. You don't realize it because your prose tells a very visual picture."
Hmm.
So so there is that, but like I'm a big fan of, great wordsmiths like PG Woodhouse and um, I'm trying to think of who else is on my shelf. I even like um, Ian Fleming,
Hmm.
his
Hmm.
James Bond stuff. But I'm also a fan of people like Hemingway and Ursula K. Le Guin. Le Guin, is it Le Guin or Le Guin? I'm never sure. I've never heard anybody say it out loud.
I'm not
Uh,
sure. I've always said Le Guin, but I'm not sure that I've actually verified that anywhere either. So,
yeah. So I'm a
but
big
Lathe
fan
of
of,
Heaven, yeah, yeah, great,
yeah,
yeah.
Light of Heaven, Left Hand of Darkness. And then there's Octavia Butler. I love
Hmm.
Octavia Butler. So the work, the writing that I've done tends to be romantic comedy, although I've done uh, some science fiction, and that's not even a category that's allowed in comics.
Hmm.
Whereas
Hmm.
I can do quite well writing that kind of thing in prose. And the most popular novel that I've done is one that I did a very, very detailed adaptation of Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice,
Hmm.
where I literally read that book and word for word looked for ways to contemporize it
Oh
so
wow,
that
yeah,
the context still translated.
yeah.
And so I created, it's two cast of peoples. It's a rich video game designer and a poor woman who runs a restaurant in with her family in a nudist resort. So it's called Pride and Nakedness, and it still sells pretty well. And but it's they're you get to one of the things that I love about PG Woodhouse specifically is the way that he will put words together in ways that almost don't make sense, but they just make you laugh, or they'll just tickle your funny bone in a way that you didn't expect, or they'll make you think in a way that you didn't expect. And it's that's the real difference. But at the same time, that comes back and informs some of the way that I write
Hmm. Hmm.
in comics as well. So I'll really work on dialogue, and I'll really work on Woodhouse was a master of the suspensive sentence, so that his last word always made the payoff for the entire sentence.
Yeah,
So I learned some of that from him, and I've really focused on his strong story sense, and the fact that he would break down a story so well that every little piece would fit together to form a greater whole. Just the way a single sentence, he would do that with a single sentence, and he would do that with an entire story. So I love prose. I love writing in prose, but I can't stop working in that visual medium. And then when I get pages back from what I've written that Pat's drawn, oh my
Mm.
God, it's like
Hmm.
heaven. It's looking at this stuff, and he and we just get giddy together. Then it gets lettered, and we both go back and we read it and make sure that it reads well, and we have just a blast. It's just so much fun.
Nice, nice. Very cool. Very cool. I'm glad that you didn't just pick one world or one way of creating, that you're working across media. That's a very cool thing. And yeah, glad to celebrate the creativity. Glad to have you back anytime to talk about the upcoming project with Pat as well as anything else.
That would be great. I think it'd be a lot of fun. Thanks.
Yeah, yeah.
Appreciate
Great to
it.
talk craft and creativity always.
Yeah, always. Absolutely. That's my favorite subject.
Yep, yeah. Um, well, on that note, I will say thank you so much for the time and glad to be in touch and may the creating continue.
Thank you so much.